Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. And here you can see my newest e-Power project. This is what I call the GTX 780 I Can't Be Bothered edition. Some of you might have been seeing this coming if you watched the other videos I made a while ago. So basically, this is a GTX 780 that I got sent. It had this thing, so that's a crater in the PCB, and because of that crater in the PCB, the two top phases don't work on it, which basically means you either run this thing on 4 phases, with only 2/3 the power limit it usually has, or you e-power it. And, you know, since I want to do overclocking, I decided to e-power it. But, there's an issue with that, and that issue is I already have an e-power GTX 780, one that's actually pretty good, so I don't really have a reason to get another one. But this card was only ever really gonna do anything with an e-power on it, so it just kind of existed in this perpetual purgatory of I should put an e-power on it, but it's not really worth it, and so just kind of nothing happened to it until I decided, okay, it's time to do something with the card. Just put some e-power on it, just make the card work. I do not care if it has like some minor issues. I just want to see the card work, but without like, you know, spending resources that I could use elsewhere. So that's why I put this e-power on it. Now my other e-powered 780 has an EVGA e-power 5, which is a very, very good, very strong e-power. And this one has still a pretty strong e-power, but one that has some issues. So, this is an e-power I made myself from a GTX 580 Direct CO2. This is an 8-phase vCore and a 2-phase memory e-power. And with the VRM itself, there's really nothing wrong. This is a very, very nice VRM, plenty strong, not gonna have an issue powering a 780. The problem with this VRM, there's two actually. First problem is the power plane layout, where I have the connections right here, is very suboptimal. There's just not really enough space to get a good amount of connections here. So this thing only has 4 ground pads and 6 vCore pads, of which only 5 are used, because like the 6th one's like up there and I can't really, you know, put anything there. But basically this thing has 5 ground connections, 5 vCore connections, and 1 really big fat vMem connection. And specifically the ground connections part is not adequate, especially when you consider that it's actually only just 4 connections, because this 5th connection just piggybacks off of an already existing ground connection. So like, it improves the efficiency of that existing ground connection, but it's not as good as adding a full another ground connection, because there's only 4 functional, very small ground pads on the Z-Power. And that's the main issue with it, really. It's an overall issue that there's not really enough space to attach things, but specifically the ground connections are the main issue with this. And that's kind of the main reason why I never did anything, because I was like, this e-power is just not gonna be enough in terms of ground connections, but I don't want to commit an e-power 5 for a card that I already have a sample of. But then again, this does need a dual output e-power, so I couldn't just put a 480 power board on it. This was before I figured out how to make the second output work on 480 power boards. By now I could have done that, but then again the 480 vCore VRM is like not really that strong. It would have been fine for some overclocking, but like I probably would have overwhelmed that decent but not super strong 6-phase at some point. That really wasn't a way to like properly do this without spending resources I could use somewhere else. But you know, the day where I said, let's just make this thing work, do something with it, I set aside and I was just like, I don't care if it's not gonna work properly, it's just supposed to work. And that was the birth of the I Can't Be Bothered part of the GTX 780 I Can't Be Bothered edition. Because the goal is to make this work, but beyond that, I'm not gonna do anything that's not specifically necessary. So, for example, The e-power right here needs a 3.3 volt and 5 volt voltage supply for the V-core controller in order to fire up. Normally that is done with two DC to DC buck converters that take 12 volt power from the connectors right here and then convert it down to the voltages I need. I couldn't be bothered to attach them here, so instead I took 3.3 volts from the PCI Express slot and just have a cable running along the PCB until it ends up here. And same idea for 5 volts. There is in fact a little 5 volt VRM on the card itself that's usually powering the gate drive circuitry for the stock DRMOSes. I just took the 5 volts output from that and also hooked it up to the e-power. Now this is something that a lot of people actually do normally, and this is fine. There's nothing really wrong with this. The e-power works just fine like that. My main issue with it is that now the e-power only works with this card. And I usually want my e-powers so that they work regardless of what they are attached to, so that they also work if they are not attached to anything. So I can just use them as a general purpose around 1 volt output device. This way, the e-power only runs when it's attached to the card, which makes it less flexible, which is something I usually don't want. But like, I'm not gonna take this e-power off the card, so it's not really a problem here. Second part is I just couldn't be bothered to like make the connections look nice. You can see they are very much not length matched. There's like two that are very, very long. There's several copper pieces on my desk that ended up too short. My soldering is not great either. It's just, yeah. I didn't care how the connections looked. They just had to, you know, be good enough to supply the card with power, and that's basically it. Another thing, I'm actually kind of proud of this one, is this card needs core, memory, and PEX e-powered. So that's 3 VRMs that need to be e-powered, but my e-power here only has 2 outputs. So how did I make the card work with only 2 outputs? Well, PEX and V-core usually run around the same voltage, just over 1 volt. So what I did is this. So this is a literal copper bridge from V-core to PEX. Like, it's just a literal copper bridge. So this shorts the PEX and V-core outputs together, so that the V-core VRM here now also feeds power to the PEX circuitry. There's a reason why you normally don't want that, because when you overclock, you overvolt your V-core voltage quite a bit. And PEX, you sometimes overvolt too, specifically when you're sub-zero overclocking, but not really as high as V-core, and also only when it's sub-zero. You overvolt V-core quite a lot without it being sub-zero. And all of these things might not be an issue. You know, the card still works, so it's probably not an issue. But over time, if you do this long term, there could be unforeseen consequences. It could be that running this high voltage into the PEX circuitry long term and without having the card super cold could just degrade the card or outright randomly kill it at some point. It could also make the card malfunction in other weird ways. So far it has played just fine, but there's no way of knowing that when I soldered that. So yeah, yeah, I couldn't be bothered to make another output for PEX, so my solution was there's no PEX if PEX is V-core, and yeah, that's what I did. Another thing is just kind of like, yeah, like my cap mods, just that, well, my washing machine is going, sorry if you can hear that in the background. It seems to want to shake apart reality right now. Let's just ignore the noise in the background. But yeah, so when it comes to my cap mods, again, there was no focus on making this look nice. Some of them also have legs that are way too long for my standards. This is just like, well, even a bad performing cap is better than not having a cap. So yeah, there's 10 capacitors on V-core, 3 of which are 1200 microfarad, that's the red ones, the others are 820s. And then there's also 5 capacitors on the memory power plane, just so that there's a bit more capacity on memory. The core ones, they seem to have done something, like the core is a bit more consistent about hitting higher clocks now. The memory capacitors didn't do anything. Also, adding more copper and better connections to the memory also didn't do anything. I put some motorized ceramics behind the core. That I probably also did a little bit. I also started adding motorized ceramics to the memory. I added 2 of them and then gave up when I remembered that adding all the other stuff to the memory didn't do anything. So I just kind of gave up trying to make the memory better, because at that point it's probably just shit memory and not my problem. Yeah. Another thing I couldn't be bothered is to properly terminate voltage sense wires. So yeah, the way I read memory voltage is just I clip something to this here. That's how I get memory voltage. And for core voltage, I have a wire that's running up here, which also just I just clip an alligator clamp on that, and that's how I get core voltage. Both of these are fire hazards. If they short out through to anything that's not supposed to see the voltage that core and memory are running at, or just ground, yeah, that can start a fire. You should normally not do that, but I couldn't be bothered to properly terminate them, so this is what we're doing. And the final thing I couldn't be bothered is I couldn't be bothered to insulate the card, because this thing is going sub-zero and it's doing it without insulation. Yeah. So that's how the card is put together. And let's talk about actual numbers. So with all of this, with everything we've gone through, the low number of connections, the dubious quality of those connections, and the overall jankiness of the project, what kind of clocks and scores am I getting from this? I can just say surprisingly good results, specifically for anything core clock related. The core on this card has a pretty unremarkable ASIC quality, so not anything special there, but it does appear to be clocking pretty well. So with voltage set on water cooling, I can get this to pass at over 1400 MHz in Firestrike. That is with voltage set on this, which at idle will be at 1.5 volts, which is quite a lot of voltage, but under load, the voltage actually drops down as low as 1.25 volts. And that's the average voltage, not the actual minimum. I do not have an oscilloscope. Yeah, and that's actually the second problem with this e-power that I didn't talk about before. Yeah, like it's the connections, but also load line. And I only noticed that once everything was already put together. But yeah, this VRM has a massive load line, like 250 millivolts from idle to load. And that's kind of a problem, because like 1.25 load is not a lot of load voltage. But 1.5 idle is a lot of idle voltage. So there is a lot of room to go for load voltage, which is what actually matters. But I basically can't increase it at idle without having the card just sit at sub-zero, which could maybe make it tolerate 1.6. So due to the very, very, very high load line on this VRM, I just kind of can't give the card enough voltage to, like, you know, fully scale to its maximum potential, because like once the card goes into idle, the voltage is just gonna shoot so high that the card just degrades or dies instantly if I set it too high, which is probably the main problem I'm gonna run into once this thing is actually sub-zero, because 1.6 idle maybe gonna be like 1.32 load, because like the higher the voltage is, the bigger the difference from idle to load is gonna be, because it's gonna be drawing more current under load. And 1.32 volts is not a lot of load voltage for sub-zero temperatures. Yeah, so that's not great. But even considering all that, over 1400 megahertz on the core is pretty impressive. And that's over 1400 in Firestrike. In GPU Pi, this does 1528, which is also pretty decent considering that my other really good ePowered 780 does 1724 when it's sub-zero in GPU Pi. So it's not that big of a difference. Yeah, the core on this seems pretty good. Actually, so good that I'm kinda, kinda regretting that the Z-Power is on it, because there's not really a way for me to fix the load line problem, because I plasti dipped the area around the controllers a long time ago when I made this thing, and I can't really remove it without risking to cause a lot of damage, so there's no way I can load line mod this. Also, I don't think I even have a datasheet for this thing, because it's like one of the Asus proprietary controllers, and I got all these solar spots just from someone who, I guess, just looked at the circuits and figured it out over a long time. So yeah, like, the core on this is actually pretty good. Surprisingly good. Memory, though, yeah, this is where the card becomes not really worth bothering about making better than it is currently. Because this is quite literally the worst memory I've ever seen on a 780, and it's probably not because of my ePower job. As I said, like, I more than doubled the connection that the memory has. I put all the capacitors on it. Nothing did anything. Like, nothing of it did anything. So, yeah, like, at this point I'm just going, the memory's probably just bad. So yeah, this does a plus 300 offset on the memory, which is really bad. Like, for a 780, I would expect at least 500, because plus 500 on a 780 is the equivalent of the 780 Ti's stock memory clock. Because that brings it to 3500 if you have plus 500, because 3000 stock. This does 3300, which is really bad. The good ePowered 780 I have does plus 700, I think. So yeah, the memory on this just sucks. And it's the exact same memory chips as everything else. This is Hynix 2 gigabit AFR. Every single 780 I have uses this. So it's like not having bad luck with the chips. It's just, this card just sucks at memory. It's just kinda it. Yeah. So that's not so great. So anything that like relies on memory for high clocks is not gonna be very impressive on this. Anything that only cares about core has a chance to be pretty decent. So basically GPU Pi is gonna be where this card is gonna be the best, and then everything else is gonna be kinda underwhelming for the core clocks it's gonna be running, because the memory is just, it's just dragging it down, basically. So yeah, not that I'm super sad about it. Again, this is just I'm using a 780 that I wouldn't be doing anything with anyway, and an ePower that I wouldn't be doing anything with anyway, and I threw it together, and now I have a working graphics card that I can do whatever I want with. I still see it as a win, because now I have another graphics card that I can do whatever I want with. But like, this is not, I'm not gonna put this up on my wall next to my ePowered 780 Ti Matrix, because that card, that one, that's a proper ePower job. This thing is boredom given form. Yeah, I'm still gonna run it sub-zero. There's probably gonna be a video about it. And yeah, that's probably the next time you see this card do anything. Just running it sub-zero and seeing what happens. And yeah, I think that would also be it for this video. We're getting close to 20 minutes, so I'm gonna be keeping the showing the card running part for another video. So check back if you want to see that. And until then, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye.